All right, welcome back everyone to the final pro seminar of the course on the philosophy of power. It's been a great 5 weeks. This is the sixth week and the final seminar. And here I'm going to hear from you guys what you guys have prepared. And I'm excited to hear what you've got to present to us. And we'll get right into it and start off with Dawson, please. The stage is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to begin with some prefatory remarks. First and foremost, my essay deals with propaganda as a way of inciting action in the propagandie and how it formulates men's attitudes. Excuse me, and this is coming right from Jacques Ellul. So I'm focusing on what Jacques Ellul has said in his seminal work, Propaganda and the Formation of Men's Attitudes. And the title of my essay is Propaganda in Action. So I'll be looking at propaganda specifically as it was used in communist countries such as Russia, and specifically under Mao's leadership in China in the 20th century. So allow me to begin. In his work, Propaganda and the Formation of Men's Attitudes, Jacques Ellul makes the following observation. Had it not been for propaganda in the form of literature and in the political action spurred on largely by propaganda in the form of revolution, neither Lenin nor Trotsky nor Mao Zedong could have achieved their respective goals. Can leaders foment a rebellion or a revolution with the aid of propaganda? Is the question here raised by Jacques Ellul. It was as propaganda was so pivotal to the Russian Revolution of 1917 in the hands of Lenin and Trotsky, and it was so pivotal to the efforts of Mao Zedong through the molding of China into a communist state. How is it possible for propaganda to exert such a strong influence on those subjected to it? Ellul, when writing in the 1960s, analyzed the actions of leaders in communist countries, specifically in Russia and China. The communist leaders are not the sole focus of Ellul's study. However, Lenin and Mao happen to be some of the most pronounced cases where propaganda was used explicitly as a source for exercising political power and influence. The guiding questions of Ellul's inquiry rest on what makes the propaganda effective, not whether or not it is true, for in the process of the communization of a country such as China, quote, the problem of truth or doctrinal persuasion is of no importance in the process, end quote. In one sense, the desired outcome of the propagandist is to elicit immediate action in the life of the propagandee. Even if it should require an indefinite amount of time to win over a propagandee. In the earliest stages of Maoist China, the combined forces of the propagandist were designed to be relentless, as to bombard and to leave the people without a moment's reprieve. Precisely because Mao Zedong considered his monumental task as the new leader of China to call for nothing less than the remolding of the Chinese people. This remolding and transformation of China expressed itself in Mao's ambitious strategies known as the Great Leaps Forward. Beginning in the late 1920s, Mao employed various methods for the purposes of propagandizing the Chinese people. It required the early writings of Lenin, the organization of public schooling, the strength of the Chinese Red Army, as well as the development of peasant unions. When describing the methods of Mao, Ellul stated the following, quote, the objective of Mao's propaganda is a double one, to integrate individuals into the new body politic, and at the same time, to detach them from the old groups, such as family or traditional village organizations, end quote. The project of Mao had to be totalizing. The deeply rooted tradition of Confucianism had to be supplanted with socialism. The notion of filial piety had to be eclipsed by a loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. The villages and communities on the margins of the new Chinese government had to be infiltrated with officials of the Red Army for the purposes of conditioning the peasants into an entirely new way of thinking. In every instance, Mao devised propaganda to pound, to alter, and remold the Chinese people with the machine of propaganda. This could only be achieved by what Mao called political mobilization. An absolute mobilization spanning from the workers' factories to the military, down to the peasant communities. The lives of the people were to be inundated with and nourished by the new communist values. In the earliest stages of Mao's coming to power, he implemented the use of highly effective slogans as his primary form of propaganda. It was imperative for Mao to organize people under such persuasive political maxims as, quote, benevolence for the people, dictatorship for the enemies of the people, end quote. In order to establish a polarization between Communist Party supporters and the dissidents, Mao created the peasant unions who could then freely disseminate such slogans and determine who the internal enemies of the people were. The major obstacle to Mao's machine of propaganda came from the resistance of internal enemies, who required a strong guiding hand at the efforts of peasant union officials. Had Mao not implemented the use of such unions, he could never have reached so many villages, groups, and communities in his early years of political mobilization. After all, the only limitation for a political figure of such great ambition is time. In conjunction with the peasant unions, another key component of Mao's propaganda machine came in the form of the Chinese Red Army. In Mao's own words, quote, the Red Army does not make war for war's sake. This war is a war for propaganda in the midst of the masses, end quote. The soldiers of the Red Army were trained for fighting in the traditional sense, yet their primary function was to grow into fully functioning propagandists, integrated into the masses, working alongside ordinary civilians. Again, a slogan veiled in poetic language was often repeated. Quote, the army must function amongst the people like a fish in water, end quote. The soldiers were to vanquish their opponents in a covert manner. This Red Army generated soldiers in support through sheer force and methods of persuasion. Under Mao Zedong, the Red Army declared war on the ideals of antiquity, as well as any potential dissidents, often with terror. Now, even with this threefold approach to devising propaganda, in the form of Mao's own slogans and writing, the peasant unions, and the Red Army, the use of sheer force was still necessary to mold an entire nation. To demonstrate this point, Elu writes, quote, even a propaganda centered around education cannot be without terror. In order to arrive at full compliance with propaganda, the 7% of incorrigible individualists must be eliminated, end quote. The elimination of all internal enemies is precisely what eventually followed. After nearly 3 decades of implementing the propagandistic machine of education and mobilization, more cunning tactics were required of Mao and his representatives. In the year of 1956, a new phenomenon emerged known as the 100 Flowers campaign. The promise of the campaign, with its apparently benevolent gesture, was one of democratic process, where all members of the society would meet for rational inquiry, freely expressing their criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party. In actuality, the campaign facilitated nothing close to that of a democratic process. The end result was such that all the dissenters and opponents of the Communist Party made themselves known, were now publicly exposed, and punished accordingly. These enemies of the people were imprisoned and generally executed. Mao justified his own tactics employed during the 100 Flowers through the use of a poetic flourish. Quote, "The rectification campaign could not be gentle as a breeze or a summer rain for the enemies of the people." End quote. The motivations of Mao, I believe, can be elucidated by considering his general view of human nature. Mao interpreted the human being as an infinitely malleable creature who could have ideologies and propaganda impressed upon him. To achieve his grand vision, it demanded that he accelerate his economic growth as readily as he accelerated the education and remolding processes of the general Chinese civilian. It could be argued that the efforts of Mao resulted in nothing less than the dehumanization of man. When explaining his theoretical outlook in a report of 1957, Mao stated the following, quote, "When one builds a socialist society, every person must be placed in the mold. We ourselves are being placed in the mold every year. I have gone through a remolding of my own thoughts, and I must continue." Now, I'd like to have this concluding section reflect on this era of Mao, and then look at the more contemporary implications of propaganda. In light of Mao's own era of political rule, it becomes incredibly difficult to question whether or not propaganda is an effective means of exerting influence on entire populations. Perhaps the notion that one is able to resist the propaganda of one's own country and escape the mold is a thought entertained only by naive Westerners, particularly citizens of the most affluent societies, whose field of activity is limited to the world of consumption and supported by a more modern liberal democracy. Along with Jacques Ellul, I am deeply skeptical about the theorists who speak to the ineffectiveness of propaganda, as though one could be immune to political propaganda, sociological propaganda, and even to the uses of advertising. It is true as citizens of the United States, for instance, living in a republic, the basic freedoms we experience in our lives can limit our understanding of other forms of government. In the time of Mao, people had been forced to be free, to use a paradox from Rousseau, by aggressive tactics and through mobilization, which is anathema to citizens of a liberal democracy. However, the illusions of freedom we commonly enjoy can cloud our judgment. We are not forced, coerced, or molded into a type of citizen, yet we are scarcely aware of the subversive influence of propaganda as it is disseminated through modern technology. Ellul warns against this naive notion, what he refers to as illusions of the day, namely that we in affluent societies believe that technology can make us more free. This is something to be, deeply skeptical about, and it requires further study to prove that point. After reading Ellul, the word propaganda takes on a new significance. Ellul reminds us that propaganda of the last century is dependent upon mass media. This is how it is disseminated effectively. This is how leaders and propagandists are able to reach the public sphere so forcefully. The more invasive a role propaganda can play in the life of a citizen, the greater the possibility for forming his attitude. This is to say, in how he votes, how he consumes, and how he thinks, even about his own political state and his own political party. Following Ellul's own analysis of propaganda, the quest to separate the distorted data one is daily subjected to from the undistorted information becomes almost impossible. For as I first mentioned in this essay, Ellul claimed the problem of truth is often discarded at the hands of the propagandist. The truth is replaced by mere means. The effectiveness of propaganda as a totalizing influence on society becomes the outcome that is desired at the hands of the propagandist. The content must exert a powerful force upon the viewer. It should leave one with more questions than can be answered, and lead to their being agitated rather than relieved. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dawson. Very interesting. Very nice how you brought this example of Mao and how it kind of tied into multiple concepts we spoke about in the course. I just have a question about propaganda not being concerned with truth, or you said doctrinal persuasion. What is meant by the second part? Doctrinal, is it to what extent people are made to be convinced of it, or to what extent they're just there to replicate it?
I think it's more in the former, in the sense they're made to be convinced of it, because it's sort of in the context of Mao's China specifically. Because I tried to get more concrete about how propaganda works, because at first I was thinking of propaganda across the board, and it would require like a 500-page book. And so I was thinking how Mao perceived it is that he first started off thinking that he could use Marxism as a doctrine to, as it were, persuade people of the efficacy of Marxist notions of economy and of a socialist form of government. And then he realized that he can't force people to become Marxists, but he can force them to adopt a mold of his own party. So he resorted to employing sheer mobilization of the peasant unions and the Red Army, and also, as it were, not so much agitators in the way that the USSR used them, but more civilians in, or should I say, people in plain clothes amongst the civilians, learning about their needs and trying to persuade them to join the party. And this spanned such 3 decades. So his methods became, I think, more brutal as time passed.
Mhm.
If that helps answer your question.
Yeah, and also very relevant when you mentioned the enemy of the people, the important enemy, friend enemy distinction.
Yes.
Just one point as well to propaganda and the ineffective or the disagreement with the ineffectiveness of propaganda today. I was wondering to what extent could you bring in something like uh, McLuhan's medium is the message? Is the ineffectiveness perhaps specifically the ineffectiveness of the content of propaganda in a sense that today it's kind of it doesn't matter what you consume, the propaganda just propagates consumerism. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, that's very much an aspect of it. I think that's where it leads to in in our own more affluent society, as Kenneth Galbraith called it, or as Baudrillard critiques, and that's why he calls it the consumer society, as a critique of Kenneth Galbraith's notion of the affluent society, and
Mhm.
that we might not be aware, and this gets into the psychological aspects that are more subterranean. We might not be aware of how effective it is, so we would rather be convinced that we are actually immune to it. And that's why we have these scapegoats like Mao as an example of how terrifying propaganda is when it's in effect in action, and yet we're not able to see how it's worked over us totally, as it were.
Very good point. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? If if not, then I thank you very much for your talk, Dawson. Very interesting.